Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the first side event at the IAEA Climate Atoms for Climate Pavilion at this COP conference. My name is Jana Friedrich and I am with IAEA Marine Laboratory in Monaco. IAEA is investigating the potential of coastal vegetated ecosystem as natural climate solution to increase the drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere and long-term storage in the sediments. You can see in the back a very simplified sketch of what coastal blue carbon means. It's very simplified, and we are discussing today more about the advantages or the other effects it could have. So this roundtable shall discuss the effectiveness of this coastal blue carbon ecosystems in storing carbon and in carbon sequestration, and the potential of these ecosystems also to preserve biodiversity. So CO2 is taken up coastal ecosystem by plants and coastal ecosystem like mangroves, seagrasses or salt marshes or farmed seaweed. And as in your garden, if the plants die, you put it on the compost, they start accumulating and they remain where they are in the ideal case. So we shall discuss the effectiveness of this nature-based solution today. I'm more than pleased to welcome our panelists today. So as you can imagine, we are not doing this work at IAEA alone, we are collaborating, and I have well-known experts on my side. And I welcome Dr. Anna Keros, and she is from Plymouth Marine Laboratory. She's a seabed and climate change ecologist, and she's doing research into the role of natural and farmed seaweed ecosystems and also the seafloor within the ocean carbon cycle. She's a member of the Blue Carbon Initiative and the Verra Seascape Carbon. So very welcome. Professor Jean-Pierre Gattuso, to my right. He is CNRS researcher at Sorbonne University and associate scientist at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. He is doing research into the effects of ocean acidification and warming on marine ecosystems and ecosystem services, and into ocean-based solutions to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. To my left, I warmly welcome Professor Carlos Duarte. He is research King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. He is marine ecologist and he addressed impacts of marine biodiversity and marine ecosystems and their capacity to recover. And he is doing research into blue carbon for more than a decade. So very welcome. So I would like to ask I'm sorry, I forgot our online panelist, Dr. Kipkorio Aratsigilangat. Could you please show the picture? So Dr. Langat is from Kenya Marine and Fisheries Institute, and he's ecologist with a focus on conservation and sustainable management, particularly on blue carbon ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass in the Western Indian Ocean. So I would like to ask all my panelists now to give a 5-minute statement on their view the potential of coastal blue carbon ecosystems due to drawdown from the atmosphere. Professor Duarte, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to join the first event of the Atoms for Peace Pavilion in Africa. because we're meeting in Africa today, which is an important region for blue carbon development. And I'd like to put a bit of context on blue carbon. So our understanding of the role of humans in releasing greenhouse gases and affecting the climate is actually a bit biased towards land. So when we look at the carbon budget, we learned that about 38% of the excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have not been released by fossil fuel burning, but actually by destroying ecosystems, changing ecosystems, and by agriculture and other practices. This term is called land use change. But in fact, hidden in that 38% of greenhouse emission, there's a component from the ocean. We don't have a component in the carbon budget that is land ocean change, but in fact, it does contribute. It does. It initiated with the hunting of whales, of which we have only 10% left of the great whales of the ocean. Each whale moves the amount of carbon of 1,000 trees. So when we lost 90% of the whales, there was already an impact. And we burned the whales. We didn't eat them. We burned them as oil to light the streets of Europe and North America. So it was a fuel that we used. We used them as fuel. And the CO2 that used to be whale is already in the atmosphere. Then we destroyed mangroves. And starting around the 1800s, we started to log mangroves around the world. And then due to poor water quality and coastal development, then we lost also seagrass. And we realigned shorelines and converted wetlands around the world, salt marshes, into agricultural soils. Rice paddies in Southeast Asia and agricultural soils in Europe and North America. So we have actually changed massively ocean ecosystems, and that component is hidden within this 38% of called land use change. The ocean is part of the 38% and therefore should be part of the solution as well. So during the 1990s, colleagues like Jean no, I think it's a generic problem because I come from another event same. So it will be a bit intermittent. The parts that you will miss are the most interesting ones. So then we did research that showed that coastal ecosystems like mangrove, seagrass, kelp forest, and salt marshes are the most intense carbon sinks in the biosphere. So we showed that during the 1990s, and in around 2005 we had the first inventory of the contribution to carbon sequestration, but by then we had lost about half of the global extent of these ecosystems. So in 2009, I was a co-author of a report from different UN agencies that coined the term blue carbon, referring to the role of avoiding the further loss and also restoring marine ecosystems as a component of climate action and climate mitigation. By that time, when the report was released in 2009, and it's the first time that the term blue carbon was used, there were already some massive projects of ecosystem restoration, not driven by climate action, but driven by the protective role and benefits of these ecosystems. For instance, in the Mekong Delta, after the American War, as the Vietnamese referred to the war, then they embarked in restoring 2,500 square kilometers of mangrove in the Mekong forest that the US Air Force had destroyed with a combination of napalm and herbicides. So within 10 years, they reforested this area, and I think still today remains the largest ecosystem restoration project ever undertaken by humans. It was not driven by climate, it was driven by the awareness of the Vietnamese people of the significance of the mangrove for their food security. Now, when the awareness of the importance of these activities for climate action came about, then scientists in Vietnam went on and calculated the carbon benefits of that restoration project, and the restoration of the Mekong mangrove delta actually contributed during 15 years to mitigate 5 years worth of national emissions of Vietnam. So in fact, a very significant contribution. Other projects were conducted, for instance, seagrass restoration in the US, again driven by biodiversity outcomes, but they showed to have significant potential for climate action and greenhouse gas mitigation. And now the Commonwealth of Virginia has published already 2 years ago a law to regulate the carbon of these seagrass meadows and seagrass restoration. And in fact, the Philadelphia Eagles, a football team in the US, has invested in achieving their carbon neutrality goals through investing in seagrass. We still don't know, for mangroves and salt marshes, we have very good data on the trends and global abundance, but for seagrass, we're still learning. So last week, we released a paper in the journal Nature Communications where we discovered the largest seagrass meadow in the world, and that was in the Bahamas. And that seagrass meadow we estimated to be up to 92,000 square kilometers. So that becomes now the largest blue carbon ecosystem, and it shows that the potential of the ocean to contribute to climate mitigation is much broader than we thought. So a significant fraction of that 38% of greenhouse emissions can be reversed by conserving and restoring these habitats. So a last point is that I'd like to make a link why we're having this conversation here, and is that whereas on land most of the carbon is stored in biomass, in aquatic ecosystems the carbon is stored in the soils. So to estimate accurately the carbon removal and carbon sequestration, we actually use isotopes, and I've been working with the IAEA for now at least 4 years to calculate, based on isotopes of lead, the rates of accumulation of carbon in these ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Duarte. I would like to give now the floor to Dr. Queiroz.
Thank you, Jana, and can you hear me? Thank you, Jana, and thank you to Pere for inviting me to this important conversation. It is a very timely matter. We have received a number of reports this week about the state of the world, of the climate system, and that I think it's really in the fore of everyone at COP27 that we don't have a lot of time to act. So it's important to also bring to the fore the role of blue carbon ecosystems and ocean carbon in helping us to slow down climate change. So I come from a background of seabed ecology and ocean spatial management, and I hope I would inspire this audience today about the things that we can do on blue carbon, where we should be really moving very quickly. Now is the time to be implementing. So what do we know? So firstly, we know that, as mentioned today, a lot of the ocean carbon is on the seabed, on the seafloor, and very much like fossil fuels, we need to leave it there. So now is not the time to be digging up the ocean floor. The soft sediments cover about 84% of the ocean seabed, so that's almost 2/3 of our planet, and they house huge stores of carbon for our planet. Leaving them there is the best thing that we can do in terms of limiting emissions from the ocean at this point in time. So conserving these habitats is extremely important, and we are failing on that, so we need to be acting on that now. That is in the hands of individual countries already. We can do that today. The second thing is that in order to keep growing those stores, we need to also be protecting the ocean processes that lead to the ocean serving as a sink of CO2 for our planet, and in that way in regulating the ocean climate system and the global climate system. And so that means that we need to protect not just the stores, but also the processes, the flows of carbon across the ocean, what we call seascape carbon fluxes, and to better understand where those sequestration hotspots are. So not just in the wetlands, but also across the ocean floor and in the deep ocean. We have some way to go on that. We have a bit of science that we still need to do to deliver that, but understanding these fluxes better and the location of these carbon sequestration hotspots in the ocean would allow us to have better accounting for the global carbon cycle. And that would mean that we can design and implement conservation strategies that would protect those processes and those sites, and therefore gain support for that conservation movement that at the moment is failing. We have many pressures on ocean space that are competing with the conservation of these sites at the moment. Thirdly, In protecting these sites, these hotspots of sequestration in the ocean, these areas of the sea floor very rich in ocean carbon, we would also be protecting biodiversity. So that goes from the coastline, from the wetlands, as well as to the deep ocean. So in addressing and protecting these sites, we are addressing not just the climate change emergency, but also the biodiversity crisis. So these are all things that we can already do. At the moment, we need to talk about implementing. So these are the no-brainers, right? So where are the boundaries? What else do we need to do? So clearly, we don't have a lot of time to act. For instance, there was this report, I think yesterday, from the cryosphere giving us a terminal warning for our ice caps in the poles. So we really need to be acting fast. So we need not just to protect what the ocean is already doing for us naturally, but we also need to be looking at these active strategies for carbon dioxide removal. And to do that, we have a range of options, a range of strategies in front of us. But I think it's a huge area of research. It's really where the science is really growing in the last decade. But we have some time to go, some work to do still. And I think we need to inject a bit of realism into this conversation as well. So I spend a lot of time working with ocean planners, so people that decide on how we use ocean space. And actually, our EEZs are completely packed with human activities. It is very difficult to allocate new space to new activities. So for instance, one of the carbon dioxide removal strategies currently under investigation in the ocean, seaweed farming, for that to have a tangible effect on CO2 emissions, to even touch on 1% of our global CO2 emissions yearly, we would need to grow this sector by 6% every year between now and the middle of the century. So that, then we are talking about an area of about 70,000 square kilometers, or about, for scale, about half a kilometer all around the coastline of the US, just dedicated for seaweed farming. Now, that might not be a very big number in the grand scheme of things, and it's certainly a small number if we think about the global biome for seaweed. But if we think about ocean space, it's actually not a trivial number. So what we need to do in this conversation about blue carbon and carbon dioxide removal is that we need to be bringing others with us. We need to be talking about not just the colleagues in the research community and in the finance community that are interested in this topic, but bringing others with us across the policy landscape, across the blue economy. We need to listen to the naysayers. We need to listen to their concerns and provide the evidence to demonstrate that we can do this tangibly now and that we have the evidence to do it in a safe and effective manner. And lastly, if you'll allow me to close my intervention, I would like to raise that we need to also be thinking about this in a climate smart way. So we need to be designing these strategies with the realization that the ocean is changing already very much, that climate change is already having an effect on our ocean ecosystems and will continue to have in the next few decades, unfortunately, because we've been so slow on climate action. And because of this, none of these CDR technologies based on the ocean will be effective if we don't think about their resilience. Where are the climate refuges for these blue carbon habitats? Where are the areas where these blue carbon habitats will continue to function effectively in the next few decades? So without climate resilient approaches to blue carbon management, we will not be effective. So I would like to thank the IAEA for having me. Your role has been extremely important in supporting blue carbon research around the world. And I'm very glad to be here with you today and to listen to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. I would like to invite now Professor to provide his statement.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Jana, for the invitation. I am also very pleased to be at this inaugural side event of this pavilion. And also in good company with Anna and Carlos. Blue carbon has gained a lot of attention recently, since the term was coined, as Carlos described. It has attracted a lot of attention because of the carbon that is stored in the soil, also because it is a nature-based solutions, and it has multiple benefits. And the traction has been such that yesterday at the high-level segment, I have just a few quotes from high-level people. The director of the London School of Economics said carbon markets should be a source of income for carbon sink-rich countries. Also, the representative from Bremen said she urged to promote nature-based solutions that help restore ecosystem services and preserve societies. The president of the Seychelles, quote, said that mangroves and seagrass beds not only clean up domestic emissions, but also those of the rest of the world. And finally, a last quote by a Kenyan president for the African group. He said, carbon credits are Kenya's next significant export. He urged developing carbon markets that help communities and not intermediaries. It really shows that this blue carbon has gained a lot of attention, and quite justifiably. But there is an issue with accounting. And as you know, perhaps, as part of the Kyoto Protocol, there was a scheme called REDD+, which promoted reforestation on land. And there was very perverse incentives. And there were loopholes that some companies used to deliver credits which were not justified. So I think it is important that we make sure that those accounting issues do not occur for blue carbon systems. And recently we have reviewed the literature and we have described 7 areas in which blue carbon research should be performed. And that is in order to have verification systems that are honest and that carbon credits are given where justified. You can be sure that when money is at stake, there will be lots of people, predators, jumping to the money. Those uncertainties are related to the fact that blue carbon storage is very, very variable according to study sites and even within the same study site. There is also issues with emissions of other greenhouse gases, such as methane, that need to be measured in order to have a proper accounting. A complication with calcium carbonate precipitation and dissolution, lateral transport from elsewhere and also to the open ocean, which is quite good because that's a very nice way to store carbon, to put it in the deep ocean. And perhaps very importantly, the permanency of the carbon storage is also very critical. Those blue carbon ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change and other anthropogenic impacts. For example, in 2015, 40 million trees died in the northeast of Australia in a mangrove, which shows really that this permanency issue is very difficult, of course, to control. It had nothing to do with climate change. It had something to do with a Niño event which reduced the water available to those trees. So the message is one needs to be very honest. We need to develop research in all those areas to lift those uncertainties as fast as possible. And of course, what I have discussed about is the role of mitigation. But as we said earlier, there are many other benefits to blue carbon ecosystems in terms of coastal protection, in terms of food security, in terms of water quality. The water quality is much improved, maintaining biodiversity. So it's a no-brainer that those ecosystems need to be conserved. And in fact, in the previous study, actually with Carlos, we described those systems as low-regret ocean solutions. Low regret because even though the share to mitigation is small, although every share is important, there is no magic bullet, but they provide so many benefits that we know how to do that. Carlos described the restoration of the Mekong Delta. There are also very big success stories restoring salt marshes. We know how to do it. It should be done, but we must be very careful with providing carbon credits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you highlighted, it's very important. The co-benefits are very important. So benefits for protecting or restoring biodiversity, also fishing grounds for local people, coastal protection. There are many co-benefits. And this takes me to our next panelist, Dr. Langat. Could you please in?
Okay.
Can you hear me? Could you unmute your mic, please?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Are you catching me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please provide your statement from the perspective of conservation.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to thank IAE for giving me opportunity to participate in this. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it on time to come in person. I would also like to thank my fellow panelists, Carlos, whom we have not met, but I've seen a lot of this work, also Katuso and the rest. From the Kenyan perspective, the blue carbon ecosystems, particularly mangroves and seagrasses, in most of the time have been overlooked by various institutions and governments. They have not been included in even greenhouse gas emissions. I'm trying to look, they have not been included in the greenhouse gas emission accounting. And in most cases, they used to be regarded as wasteland. But fortunately, with institutions like KEMFRI, we have been able to create awareness on the importance of these ecosystems, which I will not want to highlight more because my colleagues have already mentioned. But I would like to maybe mention some of the key achievements we have done as research scientists from Kenya. One is we have been able now to look at even the map these ecosystems, track the changes in them, for example, from 1996 to 2020, we have been able to track and see what are the changes which have occurred, which have resulted also in carbon emission from this ecosystem. And we also did some experiments on carbon emissions using surface soil restoration experiment and also surface elevation. And we showed that there is when you have uncontrolled conservation of this ecosystem, they will contribute significantly to the carbon emission. What we also have done is include communities in conservation of this ecosystem, particularly the mangroves, where they can now be legally involved, for example, in Kenya. They can be legally involved in conservation by forming legal entities. And then secondly, they can also, using the model of fisheries, sustainable fisheries management, they can also be able to be involved in conservation of seagrasses. What we know from these ecosystems is that they can be good potential or cost-effective tools for nature-based solutions, particularly the climate, ocean climate actions, which it has been shown that the ocean can provide about 21% of what is needed to reduce or to be on the 1.5 degrees pathway. And out of this, mangroves can contribute about 10% of this percentage. And we have also shown that when you invest in conserving this ecosystem, using our example in Kenya and the rest of the world, you can get up to what we call the return on investment of about 6%. I mean 6-to-1 ratio. That is, if you invest $1, you are able to recoup about $6 per year when you invest on this ecosystem. So they provide great opportunities. What we require now is for us to able to quantify. For example, we need to have complete carbon budget for these ecosystems. What we mean is we already have what we said.
Excuse me, Dr.
Yes.
Langard. It's very difficult to hear you. It's not your problem. We have some sound problems. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. I thank you very much for your statement, but the noise here is, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I apologize for the sound quality. So I guess there is room for improvement for virtual participants. With this, I would like to enter into the panel discussion, and I would like to throw a question into the round of my panelists. What is your opinion? How mature is our understanding of the potential of coastal vegetated ecosystems in sequestering carbon at a global scale? Ecosystems as for mitigation. Who would like to start to answer?
There are many estimates, but due to the uncertainties, even the uncertainty of the surface area of blue carbon systems, it's very uncertain. It's very uncertain how much each of them stores. The IPCC in the special report on the ocean and the cryosphere said that it is less than 1 to 2% of the 2015 CO2 emissions. So it's a very small share. But as I said earlier, there is no magic solution. Every wedge will be very critical for mitigation, so it should be done. And as I said, so it should be implemented in order to reap all the benefits.
Who else would like to?
Well, first, it doesn't work, but first as a piece of technical advice, because I'm coming from another pavilion also opening, I think the issue is that the space is saturated with the frequency of microphones. There's probably 1,000 microphones in this space, and they're interfering with each other and the phones. So I would recommend that you try to get cable microphones, and that will remove the issue. So that's not blue carbon, but probably a useful suggestion. But I like to pause and think more broadly about blue carbon. In my opinion, blue carbon is just a start, and it's significant because the first time in, I would say, possibly Western history, because there are some other cultures that have other values, but it's the first time that marine ecosystems have value other than dead, right? So usually we derive value from the ocean by killing it. We take fish, we remove mangroves, use it as wood, but up to now, there is no value, no monetary value, no market value on living marine ecosystems. So blue carbon is the first time that there is a monetary value for repairing damaged coastal ecosystems and also protecting ecosystems that are threatened. In my opinion, that is far more significant than the conversation today about climate. It is a game changer in terms of how we interact with the ocean. So please keep that in mind. And that's very, very important for communities, particularly in the Global South, island states, which have been waiting for help from developed nations for now 7 years until the Paris Accord, and that help is not coming. So they need to use the resources they have, and they have to implement the solutions they have. They know how to restore mangroves, they know how to restore salt marshes, they know how to protect them. And yes, while addressing all of the uncertainties that Jean-Pierre brought to our attention. And I just would like to point out that the scientific effort on blue carbon is rising exponentially. So we're actually on the track of addressing those uncertainties. We need to make sure that we don't make, and because Jean-Pierre comes from Sorbonne, then I like to quote a French philosopher, Voltaire, we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. So blue carbon delivers a lot of benefits for communities. It protects shelter, protects, provides adaptation capacity, provides food, and contributes to mitigate climate change. Again, we need to be very robust and very demanding on the quality of the data that eventually leads to the release of carbon credits. But do consider that this is very significant for many nations. And for instance, I'm working with one leader in Africa to also activate blue carbon solutions in the Atlantic coast. And Kenya is a trendsetter for blue carbon in Africa. So we need to consider that the global north might activate solutions like geoengineering, might do direct air capture. But for the global south, where the pain of climate change is the steepest, blue carbon is a contribution you can have, delivering benefits to your communities.
Thank you very much. Would you like to come into the discussion as well?
May I add a comment? Thank you. About the potential elements. Again, I don't know that this microphone is working, but you can hear me, so maybe you can hear me now. So about the potential. So I would like to talk about that because at the moment, when we talk about blue carbon, we are predominantly talking about our wetlands. And our wetlands are extremely important. They house maybe 6 times as much carbon in their soil as the rainforest. So these are quite substantial areas that we need to be protecting very much, as Carlos and Jean-Pierre were saying. But if we think about the broader ocean, there is much more potential that remains untapped when we think about blue carbon and carbon accounting in general. So for instance, Jean-Pierre mentioned in the IPCC, we think that wetlands contribute to maybe 1 or 2% of mitigation of global CO2 emissions, but the ocean is much broader than that. And for instance, seaweed are the marine organisms that have the highest CO2 fluxes in terms of macrophytes, in terms of large plants. So in terms of our global accounting of carbon is very poorly developed at the moment. The models that we use to estimate, for instance, CO2 emissions at the global level, underpinning the IPCC assessment, does not account for seaweed, which we think are huge fixers of CO2 in the ocean. And predominantly, many of these models using the global assessment do not characterize the sea floor, where we think that the largest reserves of ocean carbon are in the deep ocean. So we have a huge path to go in terms of the research, which is very prolific at the moment, but our carbon accounting for the ocean is not perfect at the moment, and we need to improve this very quickly. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I would like to pass the word now to Professor Gattuso.
Just one addition. When I said that the blue carbon ecosystems have the potential to store 1 to 2% of the global CO2 emissions, of course, when you look at regional or even at country level, it could be much more than that. For example, Indonesia has a lot of blue carbon ecosystems, and the share of blue carbon restoration in Indonesia or in Vietnam or in Cambodia is much bigger than 1 to 2%. So sometimes the global numbers hide a lot of information there.
So there is indeed a large variability geographically between the regions, but also within one region and one type of vegetated ecosystem for the carbon drawdown. That is clear, but still, well, it's very valuable. Could it be a solution, perhaps, instead of looking at this natural ecosystem, to use farmed seaweed? So I'm looking at you because you did some research into that topic. So what is your opinion on using seaweed farming as a nature-based solution to mitigate climate change when sinking it into the deep sea? So what are the unintended side effects that could occur? So one has to evaluate the positive and the unwanted side effects. What's your opinion on that?
Thank you for this question. In fact, we are about to release a study that we conducted in collaboration with the IAEA, which is the first time that carbon sequestration with seaweed farming has been quantified globally. So we have done that in 26 farms around the world in 13 nations and over the period of 2 years, with an important contribution of IAEA to estimate sequestration rates. And just to give you an indication, the oldest seaweed farm in our study is in Tokyo Bay. That has been in operation for 300 years. And the largest seaweed farm in our study is in China and is 150 square kilometers in size. So you can see it from space. In the Western world, seaweed farming is really non-existent. Totally, we have less than 1 square kilometer of farms in the Western world because of cultural reasons. But the total farm area in the world is about 2,000 square kilometers. And in Africa, it's about 5%. And 95% of that farm area is in Asia. China, Indonesia is the second largest producer, then Malaysia and other nations. So we postulated some years ago that seaweed farming might contribute to carbon sequestration because during the growth period, the seaweed release particles and material that settle to the seafloor and might accumulate there like they do in seagrass meadows. But up to now, we had not a single estimate of how much this represents. So by now, we have assessed those 26 farms, and the median carbon sequestration rate on the soils below the farm is about 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. And bear in mind that none of these seaweed farms were designed to sequester carbon. So it's a big room to optimize the removal process. And the most intense sink was in Indonesia and was removing 9 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. And we have actually quantified this over the lifespan of the farms going in Japan before World War II. So it's not just a recent estimate, but those are very robust long-term estimates. So I think that is an important benefit of seaweed farming, and we calculate that with the multiple benefits that seaweed farming bring about, we could sustainably farm about 3 million square kilometers of ocean area, which is still 20 times less than what we farm on land. So our mindset needs to change and look at the ocean as a source not only of climate solutions, but also of food and other sustainable materials. Seaweed also remove carbon dioxide, of course, during their growth, and therefore they provide refugia from ocean acidification and also ocean deoxygenation. So they also provide, these farms provide adaptive capacity. But whereas I see a huge benefit in providing that element of carbon sequestration with seaweed farming and bring it to the carbon market, we are concerned of the ideas of some colleagues that we should take this crop and sink it in the deep sea against carbon crates. First, because seaweed is a wonderful material. It's not just carbon. It has a lot of molecules that can help solve many problems on society, from delivering polymers that can displace synthetic plastics to also feeding the world and also avoiding methane emissions from ruminants, which again, if we look at this alone, that could be up to 18% of removal of greenhouse gas emission, because that's the contribution of ruminants through methane emission. If we can solve this with seaweed additives to the ruminant diet, which has been proven, then the potential of seaweed farming to contribute to climate action is really very large. So why should we sink it when there are people that suffer from hunger, when we also need to formulate sustainable diets for fish in aquaculture? So sinking it, in my opinion, is unethical, but we also don't have any understanding of what may be the long-term consequences of sinking masses of seaweed on the seafloor.
Thank you very much, Professor Duarte. Would you like to share your opinion on the seaweed farming?
I don't have much to say. I have no specific expertise, but I fully agree with Carlos that it will be unethical at this point to sink this mass of carbon. Another benefit of having seaweed farms is to clean up water because in Southeast Asia many coastal areas are eutrophied. There are lots of nutrients that need to be removed to avoid blooms of toxic algae or unintended algae. So it's a nice way also to improve water clarity and water quality. So I think it is a very nice way to do, and also using this material instead of sinking it.
May I? So I spend a lot of time studying this, so maybe I can add some more to that. I completely agree with what my co-panelists have said. I would also like to highlight that being in Africa, in a conference in Africa, that for instance, in Western Indian Ocean, in Eastern Africa, seaweed are a huge route out of poverty for women. So seaweed farming has very many social benefits, as we have mentioned. But in terms of climate change mitigation, we are still a little bit in the dark. So I think we quickly get lost into what I like to call the Schrödinger seaweed farming, which is that we want to farm seaweed because seaweed might help us into sort of lower emissions production pathways by its many uses for medicine, for many cosmetics, for many industries. But if we want to talk about climate change mitigation, we need to be harvesting that biomass and not using it because we need to keep that CO2 away from the atmosphere. So that's a paradox. At the moment, the whole global seaweed farming industry is not developed in that way. So we are farming seaweed to use. So we are not contributing to climate change mitigation, only through avoided emissions, through the use of these products instead of products that are more carbon intensive. So there is some way to go. Another thing I would add is that seaweed farms, just because we are growing them, we are also adding carbon to ocean carbon fluxes that eventually might lead to sequestration. So we already know that some of the detritus that moves away from farms might end up sequestered on the seabed, as Carlos was mentioning, as happens with natural seaweed communities. We also know that the alkalinity pool in the ocean might be a good endpoint for carbon, for inorganic carbon from the seaweed to be sequestered for many thousands of years. But the science around each of these topics is very underdeveloped. It's in its infancy. So for instance, recently we have just had a paper accepted where we have provided the first model that tracks carbon from the seaweed to the seafloor. And that is one of the ways that the research community can help to develop the design of seaweed farms in future to optimize the location of these sites in such a way that the detritus that is released from the growing biomass ends up in places on the seafloor where it might be sequestered. So for instance, we are working with seaweed farmers in the Netherlands and in the UK to help deliver that. So the research community still has an important role to play in the future design of seaweed farms, but at the moment seaweed farming is not yet a viable solution on its own. We have some work to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insight, which comes from direct research. Now I would... Yeah. Okay, I give you the floor. And then I would like to open the floor for the discussion with the audience.
Well, I would like just to note that we are sitting across the FAO pavilion, Food and Agriculture Pavilion. And I would like to, if there's something that I'd like you to walk away from this session with, is the idea that we need to avoid carbocentric minds. We shouldn't think about carbon only. We are embedded in a triple crisis of biodiversity, of climate, and food. This year, in the last 3 years, due to a combination of war and climate change and COVID, we have actually undone the progress we had made on alleviating hunger in the world. So when we look at nature-based solutions, like blue carbon, like seaweed farming, we shouldn't look at them with a carbon-centric eye. We should look at them for the benefits they bring for the triple crisis: food security, climate action, and also biodiversity, resilience, and regeneration.
Thank you very much. It is very important to move away from a carbon-centric fuel and see the co-benefits it has. I would like to open now the floor to discussion from the audience. So do you have questions to the panelists?
Hi, thank you all for being here. So my question is the restoration of mangroves going to happen fast enough to outrun the impacts of sea level rise? So, for example, I'm from the Florida Keys in the United States, which is an island chain, and we're already feeling the effects of sea level rise, and our mangrove forests are being inundated because they can't move upland fast enough to outrun the sea level rise that we're experiencing. So is this really an effective blue carbon method, or are there other ways that we can have natural defenses?
Yeah, so these blue carbon ecosystems, they accumulate so much carbon that they raise the seafloor. And they contribute to raise the seafloor at rates of about 1 to 5 millimeters per year. The current estimate of sea level rise is about 3.8 millimeters per year. So right now, sea level rise is rising at a level that is going to outpace the capacity of blue carbon habitats to raise the seafloor, but still they do contribute to mitigate that impact or reduce that impact of sea level rise, and also they protect the shoreline from storms and cyclones. So that's a very important role, but on the future, as sea level rise continues to accelerate, they might be outpaced. The capacity of blue carbon habitats to raise the seafloor might be outpaced. So some areas might become unsuitable to support blue carbon habitat. So that's something that's being modeled, and it's going to set constraints on the global recovery of mangroves and salt marshes. But I think that still only applies to a few areas. But consider that the reason why the Netherlands is 5 meters below sea level on average is because they build the polders to avoid the tides coming in, and then the consequence of that is that due to the loss of carbon from the soils and water, then subsidence brought the level down. When you actually undo that, and that has been done in Canada in Angaba Bay, and you remove the seawall, you actually have rates of soil accretion of up to 1 meter per year. So there's actually quite a lot that can be done in alleviating risks to areas at risk from sea level rise by activating blue carbon solutions as well.
So to illustrate what Carlos was saying, you know, in 2004, when there was this huge tsunami, which affected notably the coast of Indonesia, it was very striking when the mangrove had been cut and cities or coastal infrastructure was built. The destruction was massive, absolutely massive. Just a few kilometers away, where mangroves were still standing, the damage was much, much less. So it is a fantastic illustration of the benefit of mangroves for coastal protection. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
I'm a youth, let me stand. Yeah, and good morning all. I am Mohamed Jallo from Sierra Leone. I think this session is very important to me in the sense that I see it as an option to carbon upgrade so that we can use this ideology, these innovations to have an option towards the blueprint. In the sense, we, for example, Sierra Leone, we are trying as best as much so that we recycle these seaweeds to charcoal. so that and we have realized that if we use these seaweeds to use it as charcoal, at the end of the day, we will have more people stop cutting trees, more people will stop and polluting the air. And these seaweeds as well have little of, have huge amount of energy that can produce after recycling it as a charcoal. Because we started doing that, we compress the seaweeds in the tank, and wherein we burn it, and at the end of the day, we squeeze it so that the smoke will not go up, will not pollute the air. Then we allow it for a moment, and at the end of the day, we check it, and it all burns. Then we try to mold it to a smaller particles. Then we try to give some communities to use it as a charcoal instead of the normal charcoal they use. So while using that, it will give you a lot of heat, and at the end of the day, it will not pollute the air. So I believe this is a good innovation, and this is a good investment so that we support climate change. So thank you very much. That's my contribution.
Thank you very much. Would you like to respond to the statement of the gentleman?
Well, just maybe emphasize, for example, highlights the value of seaweed and the value that seaweed farming can bring to communities. So in my study on only 26 seaweed farms, those 26 seaweed farms employ 27,000 people. And out of those 27,000 people, 70% are women. And we actually asked them about how seaweed farming contributed to their livelihoods, and not only became an important source of income to their households, but they actually empower them in their role in the communities. So also for most of the innovators that are working on seaweed technology, but also seaweed scientists that I know are women. And even in Japan, they celebrate the mother of the sea, who's a US scientist that was able to resolve the life cycle of the seaweed so it can be cultured. So even the mother of the sea is a woman. So there's a strong connection between women and seaweed, not only in terms of culturing them, but empowering them in their communities. And also, as mentioned by Anna, during COVID, for instance, I was visiting Bali a month ago, where they have a lot of seaweed farming. And seaweed farming was the only thing that kept the communities away from hunger, because 90% of the GDP of Bali depends on tourism, and they were locked during 2 years. So every household has a small seaweed farm, and that is an element of resilience against impacts and also building climate these communities.
Thank you very much. Anna?
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to thank our speaker for this intervention, because it's a really good example of how CO2 can contribute to lower carbon industry processes, so an alternative to a very high carbon intensive energy source. So it's fantastic. And this is really what the seaweed industry at the moment is for these lower carbon emission pathways for these types of solutions. What I would like to say is that, because we talked about seaweed farming in Africa, what we are seeing also is the sensitivity of this activity to climate change. So for instance, we mentioned the Western Indian Ocean and women in the communities, for instance, in Tanzania, in Zanzibar, who are the main actors in this industry. And they are losing their crops annually because of heat wave effects. The seaweed farming industry is extremely sensitive to these extreme pressures and also to long-term warming. And what we will need to see in the coming years is a redevelopment of a resiting of these activities into areas that are climate refuges, where people are able to grow seaweed still into the future. So this is a big concern at the moment, and there is a lot of research that I'm aware of trying to address that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we lost one panelist. Still, I would like to ask my remaining panelists for a one-sentence final statement which summarizes your view on the capacity of blue carbon coastal ecosystems for carbon sequestration and other co-benefits. Jean-Pierre, would you like?
So, one sentence. Blue carbon ecosystems that are much valuable, not so much at this point for mitigation purposes, but for adaptation purposes, and it's a low regret option. It should be, must be implemented.
My final thought is that we need to be investing in the science to reduce these uncertainties so we can put better constraints of the carbon fluxes generated in these habitats in our global model, so we have better accounting globally of the carbon fluxes in the ocean. And in terms of implementation, as Jean-Pierre mentioned, and we talked about today, there are many co-benefits. It's a no-brainer, so let's just do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving your opinions and sharing also a final statement. And as you have heard during this last hour, vegetated coastal ecosystems for blue carbon have lots of co-benefits in addition of just storing carbon for a longer time in the sediment. It provides coastal protection, it provides economical income for coastal communities, it's habitat for fishes, it can also serve for protecting biodiversity. So there are lots of co-benefits, and we should see the whole picture. And as Professor Duarte mentioned, we should move away from the carbon-centric view, but to encompass all the benefits that nature provides for us, natural capital provides for us, and vegetated coastal ecosystems have, both for carbon sequestration but also for maintenance and preservation of biodiversity. I thank my remaining panelists again. Thank you very much for participating, and I would like to thank you for also participating in this event and for asking questions, and I wish all of us a very successful COP conference. Goodbye. Thank you very much.